the Toronto Star. I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. If you're like me, how many times have you stopped to think that someone else might be paying a very high price for the cheap hoodie you got from that giant retail store? By now, we all know the meaning of sweatshops, and we've talked a lot about the terrible working conditions at garment factories around the world that are supplying clothes to big fashion labels and franchises right here in North America. We know about the checks and balances that were talked about, especially after the collapse of the Rana Plaza in Bangladesh 8 years ago. It killed more than 1,000 workers, and it exposed the ugliness of the working conditions to the world. We've talked about workers' rights and ethical buying, and many of us try to keep track of the source of what we're wearing. But what if an investigation revealed how it's not that simple, how nothing has really changed, and how COVID-19 actually made it so much worse than it already was for these workers, almost on the scale of a major humanitarian crisis? A recent collaboration between reporters of the Global Reporting Center, including the Toronto Star, and academics has done a deep dive investigation into the disturbing world of the garment industry and how the pandemic has devastated workers who were working under severely questionable conditions to begin with. Star reporter Robert Cribb was a part of this investigation, and he's joining me now to talk about it. Hi, Rob. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So let's start with how this came about. How did this project happen? It seems to be a mix of reporters and academics, which is a little unusual. Can you tell me a little bit about your reporting and research and what methods you guys were using?
Yeah, it's a unique collaboration. It started with a group out of British Columbia called Global Reporting Center. They do big picture investigations. And the Toronto Star is invited to be part of what is a multi-year kind of project on supply chain. So various reporters and academics working together to uncover stories that speak to the supply chain issues, how we get our stuff, where it comes from, who makes it. And this is really the first kind of guinea pig test case pilot story that has come out so far, where reporters and academics have been ingrained from the starting line, working together over several months. This was almost a 10-month process thanks to COVID, where we literally dig in together. Typically, as you know, journalists do their work independently of academics, and we call them at the end and get a couple quotes. That's not what this is at all. This was a project that was built from the beginning to be a collaborative step-by-step process. Now, obviously, they took the lead on some aspects. We took the lead on others, but we had weekly meetings. We checked in. It was very much a unique kind of ongoing collaborative approach where we hit twists and turns and we talked about it and ultimately navigated it together. So it's quite unique, actually, and really rewarding.
And from what I've seen of the reporting, it's really unique, and you've uncovered many layers to this ongoing issue. And I know it's a lot, but if you could give us a brief snapshot of what's been the impact of COVID-19 on the industry.
Yeah, it's been totally revelatory to me. This is not an area of reporting that I'd really done previously. Unlike everybody else, I read the stories from the collapse of Rana Plaza 8 years ago. I was totally gripped by it like the rest of the world was. It made me think really for the first time about how I buy stuff and what I'm wearing. And that story comes back to me every time I'm in a mall and walking through and looking at the brands, many of which were referenced in that reporting. And so I came to it totally fresh faced. This is not an area that I knew a ton about. And so for me, it's been utterly gripping and fascinating to learn about all of this behind the scenes of how it all works and being able to talk to the people that are literally in the factories in Honduras and Ethiopia and India, making the clothing at length, extensive, long interviews over many months. It's been a fascinating adventure for me. And ultimately, terribly disheartening and depressing. I mean, as bad as it's always been, of course, we know that these are some of the poorest paid and exploited people on the planet. If it's possible to conceive of this, it's gotten way worse. It's almost hard to imagine how it could get worse, but COVID has decimated the economics of those who work in this industry. We're talking tens of millions of people, 35 million people work in this industry. And so what it ultimately did is cut into the incomes up to about 30% in some cases at the high end, but overall sort of between 10 and 30% cuts in already desperately low wages as a result of, the economic forces that took over the industry and the world, as well as deteriorating working conditions. Again, if that's possible to imagine, that it's actually gotten worse, not just economically, but in terms of the treatment, the abuse, verbal abuse, inaccess to basics like water and toilets. It really is what one of our experts is calling a global humanitarian crisis, far beyond anything that we saw in Rana, right? So that was as tragic, obviously, as that was. And it was really a ground zero moment for the public consciousness around this. As tragic as that was, 1,100 people died. This is every factory in every country. It is a global phenomenon that is far more sweeping than what we saw in that. And what's so interesting to me about this is we all heard about Rana, right? Who's talking about this? Like, the difference is Rana was one moment with startling imagery that gripped our eyeballs and held on tight. This is not that, right? It is far more subtle. It is the quiet desperation of lives of people that are far away. And so we don't see it because it's not photogenic. And as a result, nobody's really talking about this. I think our story is really the first one to really go in depth in a comprehensive, sweeping way about what's happening to tens of millions of people, because there just isn't that news of it,
It's interesting that you mentioned Rana Plaza and what happened in 2013. You would think it would be a moment of reckoning in this industry, and yet terrible conditions continue. I want to put a name and a person to this situation to give an idea to listeners here in Canada what we're talking about here. You mentioned Mimi in your piece. Tell me more about her and what a shift looks like for her. And you talked about wages. How much would someone like Mimi be able to earn on any given day?
Yeah, Mimi gripped us. She gripped our hearts. We talked to her at length over a scratchy telephone line. So these interviews were done, obviously we couldn't go, so they were done over Zoom or over telephone lines through translation. And Mimi, it was myself and Emma Jarrett who interviewed her one morning. And I think we both knew about 5 minutes into that conversation that she was going to be a prominent face and voice and heartbeat and character in our story. She was just so lovely and earnest and hardworking and so utterly devastated by what's been going on. So she, like I'm sure millions of Ethiopians, is from, a distant region to the north in the country, but is drawn to this area called Hawassa, which is essentially a massive industrial area, which is home to garment manufacturing for dozens of brands globally. It's just these gigantic factories that are economic boons, of course, and therefore draw those from remote areas, more economically disadvantaged areas. And she came like, hundreds of thousands of others to work. She's 19 years old. She lives in a small flat with 3 other people, a very modest living. We talked to her on a Sunday. She'd just gotten back from church. It's her one day off. She works 6 days a week. So Sunday was the only day we could talk to her. She's on the night shift, which was one of the problems that emerged in her story that we delved into. So young woman leaves her home early afternoon every day around 1, takes a bus to the factory where she makes T-shirts and hoodies. Her sort of threshold quota is 800 to 1,000 shirts a day. She does a long shift, leaves very, very late at night. And there is a bus that goes back to the neighborhood, but it doesn't drop the women off at the door of where they live. It sort of drops them nearby. And of course, so they have to walk, and it's, midnight, dangerous area, well known to be a stop where, the factory workers are going to arrive every night at a certain time. And so she talked about the terror that they all face in terms of physical assault and abuse. And in fact, the day that we talked to her was the day after one of her close friends and working colleagues who lived 5 minutes from her. They got off the bus together. They went to different doorways, and her friend was raped. And it was the second time that it happened in a month. And she was very clearly still devastated. And the tremor in her voice was, we were all sort of crying on the telephone. And they, of course, begged to be moved to a day shift. And we're told, no, they're not going to do it. She's lost about 30% of her income over COVID. She makes 25 birr, which is Ethiopian currency, which is about 72 cents Canadian. If she hits a target of 1,400 T-shirts in a day,
Wow. Yeah.
which is like, I'm trying to imagine what that means, 1,400 T-shirts. If she hits that target, which she says she often does, most frequently does not. She'll get an extra 7 birr, which is about 20 cents. So on the best possible day, she'd make $1 Canadian, most days about 92 cents. There's no minimum wage in Ethiopia. Various studies have shown that these particular workers in this region are among the lowest paid garment workers on the planet. So, just the gross inequity, as bad as it has always been, has just ballooned to an extent that really does feel grotesque and unfathomable.
Right, like you mentioned, a daily quota of making more than 1,000 shirts and having a base salary of just $1 a day, which is now also being cut by as much as 30% during this time. Not to mention all of the other trauma and safety issues you talk about. What other issues do the workers share with you under these circumstances where I'm guessing their options are getting even more limited?
Yeah, one of the questions we inevitably ask in these interviews when you keep hearing this sort of litany of horrible sort of conditions is like, why do you stay? Like, why do you not go seek something else, find something else? And, you really do get the sense, you learn very quickly that it's a naive question, right? It's just a classic North American naive question. There just really is nothing else. It is this or it is nothing. This is the opportunity. This is the industry. And so they have to stay. And the leverage that provides for factory owners and brands is obvious, of course, So if they don't fall in line or if they complain, et cetera, it's not just losing your job, for example. It's losing this letter that they need, right? It's sort of like in our North American terms, it would be a reference letter. So without this particular piece of paper, their odds of getting hired anywhere else are virtually nil, as we were told. And so you put your head down. Some of the issues, certainly lack of PPE came up again and again, broken promises in terms of wages, hostility towards any whisper or whiff of unionization or certainly union militancy. Verbal abuse, we had people tell us that, they're routinely called animals and beaten and hit and told not to get up out of their chairs for the shift, et cetera. And it's all the things that you can imagine without any hope really of escape. This really is, to think about that as this is it, like this is your lot. And the odds of any sort of meaningful legislative response or altruism on the part of industry to address it are distant, it's so distant as to be meaningless.
We'll be right back. And like you mentioned, this lack of PPE and just so many other factors. But even here in Canada, we've been covering and talking about outbreaks happening in warehouses and factories just here, where there's a system of checks and balances to some extent. This must have been exponentially worse there, where there is much lesser accountability. Did they talk to you about outbreaks and getting infected?
Yeah. We talked to one Honduran man who was infected, and he has 3 kids, and they got infected. And so then here's the next problem, right? So what do you do when you get infected and you can't go to work? Well, you don't get paid is what happens, So it's another material difference between the world that we live in here and there. So 50% of the respondents to this survey, so this is part of a survey of 1,100 workers in 4 countries, 50% received $0 in terms of subsidies from governments or NGOs, just zero. And when you don't go to work, that's it. There's no equivalency to the types of programs and leniencies and SERBs and the kinds of things that we're used to here. So these are very stark choices that one must make in a circumstance where you test positive and what that practically means for you. It's a different mathematic than what most of us are used to in Canada.
Let's take a step back. I want to look at the bigger picture here about how the global supply chain sort of connects everybody in this thread. Could you talk a little bit about that link and what was the connection between how the pandemic affected all these big names, these global retailers overall, and then the impact down the chain of this at the lowest rung?
Yeah, so listen, there is no question that this hit the brands, the garment brands globally in a profound way. We stopped buying clothes, and so obviously there was tremendous upheaval in the economics and the model of the industry. They're evening out now, things are better. So to be clear, there's no question that there was hardship on the part of the industry. There's no question. And what we learned and ultimately spent months digging into is that when that happened, they began applying for and receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in Western government money, including from Canada. And that was designed largely to offset the impacts and to ensure that their employees and staff, and ultimately the trickle down, that those who are actually making the product that they sell are protected. And there's no question that it's been effective, at least for their domestic staff, their retail staff and things like that, that they've been made very clear to us that they've received that money and confirmed. We went to 19 different brands, surveyed them on how much they got and how they spent it. But at some point in that trickle down, it stopped before it got to Mimi. There's no question about that. And they acknowledge it to some extent. The industry official that we talked to, sort of a spokesperson, acknowledges that that's what happened. And so that's the top of the supply chain. It's the Gaps and I don't want to single any. It's all the same. The Gap and TJX and Lululemon, that's the top of the chain. And they got hit. And they got government money to address it. And then by the time you get down to the factory levels, the decimation there was largely because the brands, in the midst of this huge consumer pullback, canceled orders, retroactively canceled orders. So this is for orders for clothes that are sewn in boxes, ready to go. Canceled to the tunes of, hundreds of millions of dollars. And so when they chose not to pay those orders that were fulfilled, the impact, the trickle down to the factories and ultimately the Mimis of the world was profound. And it's a source of tremendous contention among industry watchers and advocates and NGOs that there was this, what they would call sort of cold-hearted cancellation of work that they commissioned and, had done. One example of that we featured in the story is TJX. So there was widely reported cancellations of major orders, despite the fact that they got hundreds of millions of dollars in public money, including I think it's $200 million in Canadian public money. But they didn't really respond in any meaningful way to those kinds of questions. So at the end of the day, the poor absolutely got much, much poorer. And then one thing that we didn't get into, but it is a really interesting point, which is there's different tiers at the bottom, right? So there's the Mimis who work in the factories, but if you actually go deeper, there's 2 or 3 more tiers. There's the people who do the dyeing, and there's the people who pick the cotton. And so the lower you go, when you get into that kind of forensic, of course, it's virtually impossible to in any way quantify the harm when you get right down to the nitty-gritty of the beginning of the chain.
Right. Like you said, so many components to this, even at the raw material or the source material level. And you and I are talking about this. I'm wearing a hoodie, you're wearing a t-shirt. And to be honest, I haven't really thought about it as much or tracked it down to these various components that you're talking about. So I know you spoke to a lot of people. Do we have any answers to how, on a personal level, we can become ethical buyers? And also, is there an equity aspect to that as well? Because not everyone has the privilege or luxury to source what they're wearing. And often the hoodies and jeans from the big chain store retailers are affordable options.
So it's a really intractable problem, and it's one that fascinated me in all of these interviews. In fact, we ended every interview with one question, which ultimately ended up being kind of a sidebar in our series, which was, how do you buy your clothes? So these are academics and NGOs people and industry people. And we asked them all that question because it is difficult. There's no question about it. As much as I've learned and as much awareness as I feel like I now have about this relative to 10 months ago, I still don't know that I have a silver bullet in terms of how to address it. I'm more conscious of it, and I guess that's the first step. So here's some of the responses that you get. The most obvious one is I buy less. I'm not buying clothes all the time. I have 2 pairs of jeans and I have 5 shirts, and I wear them until they wear out, etc. And at first I thought, okay, I'm down with that. I can get on board with that. But then, the more you think about that, so now wait now, if what we're talking about is Mimi and serving Mimi's interests, is that really a solution? Because Mimi makes clothes for a living with the hopes that they're going to sell, which is going to continue a market, which is going to feed her and her family. And it doesn't really. It doesn't. I don't think Mimi would say buy less clothing, right? So I get that. And there's lots of reasons why we all buy too much. But in terms of this specific question is what's going to help Mimi, I'm not sure that that's going to do it. So then the next question is, okay, can I buy smarter? Can I be more conscious of where it's coming from? Is there a fair trade label, for example, as we have in coffee? And the answer is no, there isn't. And there's certainly shots at it. There's efforts I shouldn't say it doesn't exist. I should say that there was no widespread embracing of a particular label or certification or verification in the people that we talk to. And it's partly because garments are way more complicated than coffee. Because of all of these tiers, there's so many different elements to it. It is not one farm. It is not one bean moving through a process. It is so many different pieces. That said, there are some better than others, and there is lots of research out there on who's being more conscious at a corporate brand level than others. And that information is out there for you to read. And certainly I've spent a lot of time looking at that. Some people said I rent my clothes, which is interesting. And I looked in Toronto, and there are lots of places where you can rent your clothes.
I did not know that.
Not everything. You can't rent your underwear. I mean, at the end of the day, you're still going to have to buy stuff. But we had 2 or 3 people say, stuff that I'd wear out, or I don't go buy dresses, or I don't suits, or I rent, which was an interesting answer. So that's all the personal choice stuff. The other category of answer is pushing for meaningful, high-level policy, government-level change. And we have been terrible at that, I think, in the West. I don't think there's true engagement in this issue at all. I think it's seen as far away, doesn't affect us. I like my cheap clothes. I think we're complicit. Why, for example, would we as taxpayers pay hundreds of millions of dollars to brands and subsidies without requiring a basic requirement that they pay their bills? Like, why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we require that money is accounted for in detailed accounting statements that are public? We asked the federal government, how much money have you given to this industry? And they basically said, can't tell you that, don't know. Or it's proprietary. We're not going to give you amounts that we gave to individual companies. It's proprietary. So there was this long dance. We went to the government. They said no. Then we went to the brands. And some of them said, here's what we got. And others didn't. I mean, first of all, should this not be completely open and transparent, how much public money we're financing? And secondly, should there not be basic requirements to compel those receiving these hundreds of millions of dollars in public money to simply say, here's how we're spending it or not spending it? We're not going to pay Mimi with it. We're just going to tell you we're not going to pay Mimi with it. And should they be able to say that? Or should there be some requirement that they have a duty, a moral, ethical, economic duty to use that money to cover the entire chain that they use to bring clothes to market? So these are unanswered questions. At the moment, the answers are no, but there is certainly a strong feeling that this horrific test case has shown that we really don't have the kind of forethought to direct the subsidies and relief that we have to actually reach those who most desperately need it.
Right, because, Canada is talking so much about equity and human rights and a reckoning during this pandemic here at home. So it makes sense for that discourse to extend to things that might not be as geographically close, but they're still linked to us. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Thank you so much for your time and your insight. You've been great, Rob.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
I was talking to Robert Cribb. He's an investigative journalist at the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tizaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So-Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.